Hello, this is Jurgen Rasmussen speaking. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Today's episode is a special one. It's about the relationship between the mind, what we could call psychosocial, spiritual factors, and both the development, progression, and sometimes healing of cancer. I know that this is a very controversial topic. I wanted to make it for quite some time. Some people have asked me to make it, and it's also a response to something that recently happened. Very recently, the Norwegian Cancer Association made a series of campaigns where they flat out state cancer doesn't care. And it shows these video snippets of people, being deeply engaged in their hobbies, in their life. Uh, and then kind of ending with the idea that cancer doesn't care. And this, I think when they do this, they are, first of all, not having science on their side, and B, it's unethical, and C, it contributes to a very strong nocebo effect. They essentially imply that cancer is strictly a biological, mechanical disease, and that whether you live a meaningful life, whether you're engaged, whether you have a passion or a zest for life, or whether you live with strong feelings of hopelessness, that it really doesn't matter. The only problem is it does matter. It does matter a lot. And there's plenty of research, anecdotal evidence, and scientific findings to point in that direction. Another implied statement is essentially, just live as you used to. But this is also a dangerous message, since there is consensus that cancer is about 75% environmental and lifestyle oriented. Now, it's important to realize this. We are bio-psycho-social beings. There's a very strong flaw in modern medicine, in that it has a tendency to do two dramatic errors. One is to separate the mind from the body, to think of psychological factors as one thing, and to think about physiology as something else entirely, and implying that our emotional lives, well, stress might, make things more difficult to deal with, but it's not really much of relevance. And the other one is to isolate the individual from its environment. So this will likely be a two-part series, and what I want to do in the first one is to point to both stories from my own practice, from colleagues, from the literature, from science, that points in the direction of there being a relationship between psychology and the development of cancer. My message here is not one of mind over matter. There is a danger in overselling the psychosocial factors. They're not the only game in town. So I'm not saying that, or even implying that it's the only game in town. It isn't. But on the other hand, there's a huge danger in completely ignoring it, and either directly stating or implying that, look, these things really have no relevance. Lives are lost because of this, and it's really, really unfortunate. So let me start off with some stories before I go into the research. Back in, I think it was 1950, or at least the early 50s, a medical doctor by the name of West left the hospital on a Friday night, not really expecting his patient, Mr. Wright, to survive the weekend. Mr. Wright was terminally ill, expected to have hours or or perhaps days at most to live. He had lymphosarcoma, a generalized and advanced malignancy of the lymph nodes, tumors the size of oranges spread through his body, his vital organs were failing, and a full-time oxygen mask was required to support his breathing. Now, his prognosis was so poor that he was essentially given up. Now, at the time, there was some hope that a drug called carbimazine could be a solution to the riddle of cancer. And Mr. Wright was really way too sick to even be considered, but he pleaded and begged with his doctor, Dr. West, to give it to him. And Dr. West was somehow experimental and thought, well, let's just do it. Give a dying man his final wish. Now, when Dr. West came back to the hospital on Monday, he was stunned to find Mr. Wright off his oxygen mask, wandering around in the halls, flirting with the nurses, being bright-eyed and full of energy. and within 5 days, his tumors were half the size. Within 10 days, he was cancer-free. So Dr. West was super enthusiastic and drove around to other hospitals to check in with various patients who were also on carbimazine. And to his enormous disappointment, he found that the only one who really seemed to be benefiting from carbimazine was Mr. Wright. Now, he was smart enough not to tell Mr. Wright that. Mr. Wright recovered, had a remission, and went home to live, even started flying his airplane again. Now, a few months later, the reports started coming that carbimazine had not been effective in the treatment of cancer. And Mr. Wright panicked and called the hospital and said, what on earth is going on? And his cancers reappeared. And he ended up back in the hospital again in the same grave condition as the last time, and was on his deathbed. Dr. West decided that this situation required extreme measures, so he told Mr. Wright that they had discovered what was wrong with the old carbimazine, and that this time they had an enhanced, double dose, super powerful carbimazine that could help him. And what he injected him with was water, essentially. And this time, without the carbimazine, the effects were even more dramatic. In Dr. West's own words, his tumors melted as if on a hot stove. Once again, he completely recovered, went on to live for several months with no sign of cancer whatsoever. But then the American Medical Association came with its dramatic conclusion in the media that carbimazine had shown to be completely ineffective in the treatment of cancer. Mr. Wright panicked, called the hospital again. Within a few days, he was on his deathbed, and just a couple of days later, he died. So this is a story that's been documented in medical journals. It was written about by a guy called Bruno Knopfler, who documented the case. I first read about it in the book The Psychobiology of Mind-Body Healing by Ernest Rossi. It's mentioned many other places. Love, Medicine, and Miracles by Bernie Siegel. So it's a pretty well-known story. It's by far a unique story. But this story demonstrates the power of hope, the power of expectancy, and also the placebo effect and the nocebo effect. What can happen to a person when hope completely goes away? That state of hopelessness. Now, this particular story had a negative outcome. Quite a few stories have not had a negative outcome. So, for example, in my family, I have a family member who had a spontaneous, instant remission of a lung cancer that was thought to be terminal. Now, this distant relative of mine, um, I believe, was not a smoker, but had lung cancer and not long to live. And he was a deeply religious man, deeply religious. And he went to his small church and community, and they prayed for him, prayed for God to heal him. And during this ceremony, something dramatic happened. Like he had reported that he could feel the healing, he could feel the change happening on the inside. And then I can't remember the exact details, but later on when he went to the hospital, and the guy had no treatment. So later on when he went to the hospital, not a trace of the cancer, completely gone, completely vanished. Cancer doctors from various parts of the countries, came to investigate this and to attempt to see what might be going on, and we're forced to admit that this was a legitimate remission of late-stage cancer. Now, very interestingly, many years later, I think maybe 10 or 15 years later, his wife died, who he was very, very close to. And he lost the will to live without her, and shortly thereafter, he developed cancer, some other type of cancer. And not long after that, he was dead. I had a client in my office about 12 or 13 years ago who had a remission from cancer, and this had nothing to do with me, so it's safe for me to tell the story. Um, this is a very tricky topic to talk about, in terms of the law and in terms of consequences. So, but this is a client I worked with for another issue who told me the story of how she had previously had a what's called spontaneous remission of cancer. She had a massive tumor in her stomach, gone to the doctors. The doctors had said you need surgery immediately, to survive. And in that moment, she had a flash of insight, a deep intuition that told her exactly what this was about and what to do. So she had said to the doctors, no, I'm not having surgery. I know exactly why I have this, and I know what to do. And the doctors got angry with her, and she left. And she went home and made some radical changes to her life. She was in an abusive relationship. She had huge issues with her mother. Like she really went to work as if her life depended on it, guided by this flash of insight, this strong intuition, and had no medical treatment whatsoever. Went back to the hospital a few weeks later and vanished, completely gone. No trace of the cancer. Now, the interesting thing here was that the doctor had said, well, congratulations, you've had these things. Don't happen often, but they can happen. You've had a spontaneous remission of cancer. And she said, no, it's not that spontaneous. I actually did stuff that contributed to this. And the doctor said, no, you didn't. This is spontaneous remission. It has nothing to do with what you did. And she objected and said, no, I know what this came from, and I knew what to do. And the doctor got really angry and wouldn't hear another word of such nonsense. Now, a cynic or a skeptic, might say, well, the doctor's probably right. There probably is no relationship. And that could be the truth. It could be an interesting coincidence. You can't really prove it one way or the other. But the fact that I've spoken to several people who have been in different situations, and that response from the medical doctors, unfortunately, is way too common to be met with hostility and anger or indifference. Or often, in the best case scenario, congratulations, I'm happy for you. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. And I don't really want to hear anything else about it. I'm just going to keep doing what I do. Thank you. So this also contributes to maintaining the power structure, maintaining the mind-body split, maintaining the theology of medicine that is so insistent upon only thinking in terms of mechanical factors and biological factors, and completely ignoring the individual and his or her life conditions. Now, I want to say this. As I said, my message here is not one of mind over matter. I acknowledge that there are many other factors at play. It's more a message of mind matters. And that if someone has developed cancer, you know, it is smart to open the psychological and emotional doors and do one's best to see what can be discovered there. Now, there's a really interesting finding, and that is that until about 1900, it was common sense in medicine. It was so well established to link the patient's psychological and emotional life with cancer. There was so much to support this. Now, this was at a time where they didn't have, you know, the complex testing, the technological innovations of today. So they were actually forced to spend time with their patients and listen to their patients and listen to their stories, and there's and to get to know them. And there's a wisdom in that's been lost through, you know, the current bureaucratic, impersonal, technological approach. Now, unfortunately, at the time, they didn't really know how to work with these things. So you might establish a link, but it didn't seem to be of that much use because they really didn't know how to work with it or how to approach it. Since 1900, you know, the technological innovations have been fantastic in many ways, and medicine has largely ignored or forgotten these things. So let's take a little bit of a look at what has a tendency to happen with cancer. Um, the typical cancer client profile, and this was outlined by a psychologist by the name of Elida Evans in a book about the psychology of cancer back in 1926 that Carl Jung incidentally wrote the foreword to. These findings are also confirmed, you know, by Lawrence Lashon, who was a cancer researcher who spent decades interviewing cancer patients and working with terminally ill cancer clients. This is truly a hero of modern psychology. He's written several excellent books. You Can Fight for Your Life is one that I highly recommend if this topic is of interest to you. So the typical pattern is this. In childhood, there is, compared to control groups, a tendency to feel unwanted or unloved or unappreciated. Some early childhood wounds around that gives rise to the perception that having close emotional relationships with people is risky. There are some studies that show that kids who are severely abused have a 50% higher chance of developing cancer as adults. Often there's a lack of connection with either both or one of the parents. So this all gives rise to a notion or a feeling on the inside of not being enough or not being wanted or not being appreciated. What then has a tendency to happen is that the person develops a set of tendencies, a orientation of self-appeasement, of self-sacrifice, of avoiding conflict, of not being in touch with emotion, of not being able to express anger on their own behalf, as it seems to be a very, very strong correlation. So they end up living a life where they speculate and calculate into who does other people want me to be? Who does the environment expect me to be? And then they spend their energy attempting to live up to those external standards for approval, for love, for appreciation. Um, and what then has a tendency to happen very often is that they end up putting all of their eggs in one basket. So they might get into a job or a relationship or have some sort of role that essentially becomes their identity, where they get that appreciation, you know, they and what then very often has a tendency to happen is that when this relationship ends, when they get fired, you know, when they retire, or when their kids move from home, or when they go bankrupt, or when their partner dies, you know, there's some strong emotional loss. Often a trauma or a severe loss or a severe conflict that they could see no solution to. They have a tendency to then reopen the childhood wounds and respond with a feeling of hopelessness. That tendency of responding to life's losses with a deep sense of hopelessness seems to open the door for the development of cancer for those who are predisposed to it, to a larger degree. Now, there are, I'll check here, some studies by Dr. Schmale and Dr. Eicher who discovered that about 76% of cancer clients had some sort of, you know, big trauma, severe loss in their lives where they responded with hopelessness, often happening somewhere between 6 and 18 months before the onset of symptoms. There's an interesting study by a guy called Kissen, Dr. Kissen, who looked at lung cancer clients and found that the smokers who did not have good outlets for their emotions, you know, the repressors, the people who couldn't show anger on their own behalf, who couldn't really be in touch with their own emotions and express them, had a 5-time higher incidence rate of lung cancer compared to the people who had that type of outlet. So think about it. You know, if smoking caused cancer, then everybody who smoked should have had cancer. Now, it's really well established that smoking increases your chances of developing lung cancer. But clearly there are other factors at play that has to be there for a person to develop lung cancer. Because most heavy smokers don't develop lung cancer. And there are also people who develop lung cancer, like my family member, who have never smoked. So even if this is a strong correlation and strong finding, according to Adrian Raine, a criminologist who's the author of the very interesting book, The Anatomy of Violence, says that the link between smoking and lung cancer is actually weaker than the link between antisocial crime, violence, and having a low resting heart rate. It's actually an interesting finding. looking at 48 factors of who develops into antisocial repeat violence. The strongest risk factors were low resting heart rates and poor concentration. So the link there is actually stronger than the link between cancer and smoking. So, but if you combine smoking with people who don't have an outlet for their emotions, it seems, then you have a much stronger chance of developing lung cancer. So this is another example of not mind over matter, but mind matters. There seems to be links there. There's a really interesting study. Let's see if I can find it here. By Price, Tennant, and Butow in 2001, which showed that women who had a traumatic loss type experience and also experienced social isolation had a 9-time higher risk of developing breast cancer. So so these are these are interesting findings. You know, even old Greek doctors, you know, from 2,000 years ago, were talking about the relationship between deep grief, emotional loss, depression, and the development of cancer. So the pattern that I just mentioned from Lawrence Leshon and Elida Evans, people have been able to predict with around 75% who would develop cancer and who would not, just based upon knowing these personality tendencies in a client. So Lawrence Leshon says that over 90% of the people who went to him for intense psychotherapy actually displayed that particular pattern, whereas only 10% of the people who sought him out did not display that pattern. So of course, you know, same as with the smoking. There probably are people who are psychologically very healthy, who have had, you know, loving parents, where one has done everything right, who still develop cancer and who still die. You know, that is, so this is the tricky ethical position in terms of spreading this message, is that on the one hand you risk parents who have lost children, you know, to cancer, to watch this and to read this and to go, oh my God, you know, did I completely fail as a parent? And some of these parents might have been very loving, very caring, might have had a child who seemed to have a happy life, and they develop cancer and they die. And I can only imagine that listening to a message like this might be very, very provocative. On the other hand, I think it's even more ethically wrong to not promote the information, to not talk about this stuff, because there are so many animal research studies, for example, that show that if you can induce a state of hopelessness, you know, in rats and mice and stuff like that, that way more of them will develop cancer in various experiments. So that link is very well established, you know, with animals, and by the looks of it, you know, with human beings as well. So stay tuned for part two. Before we go there, for anyone who wants to look at relatively recent information about the relationship between psychological factors and the development of cancer, I recommend this book here. It's called Mind-Body Unity: A New Vision for Mind-Body Science and Medicine by a guy called Henry Dreyer. Don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. This one's rather conservative, but it goes through most of the studies, trying to make that particular link. I'd also highly recommend the book by Carl Simonton, You Can Get Well Again, and also Lawrence Lashon's You Can Fight for Your Life, for anyone who wants to explore this. In part two, which is going to be a more optimistic series, I'm going to talk about stuff that seems to have worked in terms of creating both spontaneous and not so spontaneous remissions, and also based upon the psychological literature, what you can do to likely reduce your chances of developing cancer to begin with, and also in relationships to how you raise your kids. So stay tuned for that. Okay, be well. Thanks.